Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I am your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, coming to you from a secret location in Central California. Good to be with you tonight, Aaron, and to all of you in the room. I haven't even looked to see if we had anyone in the room yet. I'm trying to get a few things ready here.
And with us tonight, we have Alicia Morales, editor extraordinaire and writer extraordinaire. So, Alicia, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Well, my name is Alicia Morales, and I have been a freelance editor for the past few years, and I enjoy writing. I'm working on my first novel, and I really enjoy fiction.
Absolutely. You also help out at the Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference, and I know you're probably a little too humble to mention this, but several of the stories that you have edited have earned awards, and I think that's due in large part to your keen eye there. So I know you don't brag about that a lot, but I was very impressed with being up there at Blue Ridge and seeing all the stories that were reaping rewards and how many of them had your name beneath the author line that said edited by Alicia Morales. So a lot of quality work that you turn out. So this is one reason why we invited you on, is to be with us and talk about a little bit about punctuation, which can still be tricky and it can be fun. So, well, I don't know how fun it can be, but you know, it's tricky and it can be interesting if nothing else. So. So yes, but before we dive into that, we do have a publishing term of the day.
Yes, considering our topic for the day, I decided to go with CMOS. That's C-M-O-S, and if you hang around book writing very long, you'll hear of CMOS. CMOS stands for the Chicago Manual of Style. Many people get the idea that punctuation, grammar, usage, all of that is standard across the board, and it's never changes. There's no shadow of variation in it. It's not true. They disagree with each other all the time. And the two big ones are the Chicago Manual of Style, which we call CMOS, and the other is the AP, Associated Press Style. The difference is AP is used primarily for short nonfiction, so it would be articles, it would be things that are going in magazines, newspapers, and stuff, and so therefore the requirements are a little different. CMOS is what book writers use. Most publishers will default to CMOS for book-length kinds of work. So it's a great book. It's in its 16th edition. I have the 15th because I'm too cheap to buy the 16th, and I'm not doing professional editing anymore. So I don't want to spend the money for it. So the publishing term of the day is CMOS, Chicago Manual of Style. You can get more information about it on the web, and you can, if you have a question about something, sometimes you could type that in the search, Google it, the question, and just put in CMOS next to it, and it will take you to a site where someone has asked a similar question, and often you can see the answers. They used to be behind a paywall. I'm not sure that they are anymore.
Paywall, that's a good term too. I don't think it's a publishing term, but it's good. Meaning you can't get all the information unless you pay, I'm assuming?
Yeah. Paywalls with internet companies. Newspapers will do that. You want to get the New York Times and you want to see it online, they'd love to have you, and they'll give you a little snippet up front, but you have to subscribe to be able to get the full article, and that's called Paywall. So occasionally in your research you'll see this. It'll say behind a paywall, and that's what they're talking about.
Okay, excellent. And so, Alicia, I'm curious, do you use the CMOS? Is that what you use for your editing primarily?
Yes. Mainly I use the CMOS for my editing, and because I work a lot in the Christian realm, I also use the Christian Writer's Manual of Style. But I usually defer back to the CMOS because that has more in it.
It's pretty extensive. It's pretty expansive. Yeah. And it does have answers for all sorts of questions I never thought would come up, but apparently I don't know nearly as much about the English language as I thought I did, which is probably terrifying considering I teach English. It's like, oh, well, I've been doing that wrong for the last decade, so no big deal. You're ruining just entire generations of people on a single stroke. So hopefully after our cast tonight, we will not repeat that mistake. But thought we'd talk a little bit about the purpose of punctuation and why it matters. And obviously, it exists in order to help the reader understand the author's intent. There's lots of simple ways to say things, but if you don't punctuate it properly, you can end up saying things that you don't intend on saying. And so it's important that we give our words these pauses, these little symbols that denote breaks in thought to let the reader know, okay, now I'm changing thoughts, I'm changing ideas, or I'm continuing one on, or this is a subset of another idea. Pops, the other reasons why punctuation is important.
Well, it helps your readers read, and you want the reading to be as fluid as possible for the readers, otherwise it becomes a chore rather than a pleasure to read. And if you've ever, well, I know you have, you've read some textbooks and stuff, and you wonder who wrote the thing because it's just too difficult to follow. And back in my college days, I'd have to read stuff by Cornelius Van Til. I was majoring in theology, and Cornelius Van Til was a old school Presbyterian, and he would have a paragraph run 5 pages, sentences that would run 200 words, and so the reader then begins to have to unpack things, and it's just a poor way of doing stuff. What punctuation does is it tells us when to stop, when to pause, when to realize we're comparing something, when something is dialogue, when something is internal dialogue. All of those kinds of things. So it's very important because, as you said, if you don't get it right, you can end up saying something you don't want. One of my favorites is the simple comma. There's a big difference between what's that in the road ahead and what's that in the road, comma, ahead, which is a little more gruesome than the first one. And it all depends on comma. We'll be talking about serial commas later, which I'll give you another example of how badly things can go. Just based on a comma. So punctuation is important because it is part of communication.
And there is that book, Eat, Shoots, and Leaves,
yes.
Talking about the panda that eats, shoots, and leaves. Does it eat, shoots, and leaves, or does it eat, shoot, and then leave? So completely different things, and those commas can be important. There are some other grammar books that have been written. Grammar Girl has a podcast about these types of things, and very, very helpful and entertaining all at the same time. So if you are more interested in some of the stuff, that's a good resource for you. But today we're going to talk about a lot of different punctuation marks. We're not going to talk so much about things like capitalization or spelling and that kind of stuff, but we will focus on those special little symbols on your keyboard that help us figure out whether something is possessive or plural possessive, and all those fun types of things. So
that's the first thing. The first thing to realize is there's a difference between grammar and usage. And usually, when you're dealing with an editor, they will talk about that between grammar, which will involve punctuation, and then usage, how things are done, and that will have the greatest variation will be in the usage part. But they are different topics, so they're closely related. And Grammar Girl has 2 or 3 books out, I think, and they're fun to read. Never thought a book on grammar would be fun, but she's written some good stuff. So,
absolutely. And so, Alicia, I think I'm going to be throwing some questions at you here and there, specifically about what types of common errors do you see with a lot of these punctuations, and what do you find yourself having to change often? Perhaps you have some sort of pet peeve, perhaps, that you see popping up. Is there anything just off the top of your head that you notice is a pretty common mistake before we start kind of going a little more systematically through all the different punctuation marks?
There's actually a bunch of them, and I find typically in a lot of manuscripts. Most are comma errors. Some are quotation errors. I know that later we're going to talk about, like Al has mentioned, the internal thought versus external dialogue. That is typically another one that I find. Yeah, there's quite a few of them, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, and you found several in my writing as well, so I can admit that on air. I can admit that. I'm a big man. I'll go ahead and say that. So some errors
Well,
there.
it isn't always the writer, and that's the one thing I keep hammering on. I know, but I want people to understand that is there's a wide range of opinion, especially among editors, especially copy editors. Those guys get in fistfights over, the Oxford comma and stuff like that. They get pretty hot. As a quick story, I had with a major New York publisher. I was doing some work, and it went through 3 copy editors, which is what you want, so they catch more. The copy editor 1 went over it. Copy editor 2 went back and changed everything, undid everything the first copy editor had done, and then the third one came in and did different stuff too, and they just didn't agree. They didn't have the same style sheet apparently in their publishing house that the most publishers do. They have a style sheet beyond CMOS, but it just went back and forth. I didn't do anything about it. I let them make their own mind about it. But there isn't necessarily a standard. There are general standards. You put a period at the end of a sentence, for example. Question mark means there's a question. But sometimes there's variation. And for example, there's an open style and a closed style among editors. And the open style is a little more relaxed, use as little punctuation as possible. Closed style is much more rigid, and usually reserved for academic kind of work where they get really, really specific about how things need to be presented.
And I think a lot of that is in the sense that academic writing the idea is to convey an idea, a message, if you will, whereas fiction is more about telling a story. So it makes sense that you can have a little more open of a style that's going to reflect kind of the thoughts, the interior monologues of your characters, perhaps some of the chaos of the world around them, etc. But when you're dealing with abstractions, philosophies, theologies, and things of that nature, and in academic language, you've got to make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's and putting dots above your commas when you're using semicolons and all those types of things. So like you say, that regimented style is a little more important there, for sure. So, well, let's begin with some end marks. What do you guys say? Is there anything exciting about the period? Are there common period errors that most people make, or is it just pretty simple? You use those at the end of the sentence and pretty vanilla, that's all there is to it?
I don't typically come across too many period errors, other than forgetting to put one in. So usually when I'm editing, I will find that someone has forgotten to put one at the end of the sentence, at the end of a paragraph, for example. But other than that, I haven't really come across too many period issues. I know we're going to talk about quotation marks in a while, so we can bring that up.
Yeah, I guess that's true. There's periods, and then there's the quotation periods or the period quotations.
Yeah.
That gets a little trickier, I guess. So we'll attribute that to the quotation mark being fancy, but the period's pretty straightforward. How about exclamation points, Pops? I know you are a big fan of exclamation points, right?
Yeah. But I want to throw my 2 cents in on the period things. Usually, what mistakes writers make are typos. They're not. It's not because they don't know a period goes at the end of a sentence. It's because they're editing and they take out too much, including the period, or they take out a sentence but they miss a period, so there's 2 periods. So I always go through at the end and I search for double spaces after a period, so I can convert them to just 1 space. I search for 2 periods because those things just happen all the time. And so you kind of have to look for those. The other probably period fault, normally we talk about comma faults, but would be forcing a sentence into 2 parts that are incomplete. It would be better if they were a single sentence, and doing that with a period. In fiction, we have a little more elbow room. We don't have to have a complete sentence all the time. We can have fragments. That's just part of the culture in fiction writing. You don't want to do it throughout your book, but only to emphasize something. Now, exclamation points. They are the cockroaches of writing. I really don't like them. They do have a place. I use them on occasion, but it pains me to use them, and it pains me even more to read them. And when I was doing editing, I think the record was 27 exclamation marks on a single page. And that's a manuscript page, so you're looking at 250, 300 words. They're just, it took me forever to take those things out. And you get to the point that if you're editing, the thing to do is just do a search and replace every exclamation mark with a period. In journalism, as one journalist said, he used an exclamation mark in his first story, and his editor said, "That's wonderful. That's all you get for your career. Don't ever use another one." So they're definitely overused. So they do have a place, and of course that is an end mark, so it's considered a powerful end mark. The other one is the question mark. The only two that have more weight than other end punctuation. So it's the question mark and the exclamation mark.
You know, I would say that the reason that I'm not a fan of the exclamation mark is because it calls attention to itself rather than necessarily the words before or after it. I tend to think that if I'm using an exclamation mark, I'm trying to use punctuation to do what my words should be doing. If my words are doing their job, then I don't need much more than a period, and that's kind of how I look at it. But it's interesting that you call them the cockroaches of fiction, because usually if there's one, there's a lot more, and they're probably hiding in the shadows, and so you've got to find a way to kind of bait them and pull them out. So I like how you say that. Alicia, what is your take on exclamation points?
I have a couple of takes on exclamation points. First of all is, rather than end your sentence with an exclamation point, you can always use a comma at the end of the quote that you're exclaiming and write, "She exclaimed," or "he yelled," or something, which is an active verb that will explain the tone of the statement, if that's what you're looking for. And the other thing is, and I see this often, is rather than use an exclamation point, people will use all caps in the words in order to make the point that they're yelling the words. And that's a huge no-no, especially in fiction writing, but even in nonfiction, I find a lot of all caps, and I'm constantly going back to change people's all caps into lowercase letters.
And I'll show you variation in that. I do that from time to time. I do it very rarely. And it's usually if there's a series of exclamations, each one rising in intensity. But in a book, you'll see one, maybe two of that. So I'm going to be on the other side of that a little bit. Don't use them often. It should pain you to use them if you're going to do that. But most, as Alicia says, most editors don't like them at all.
Yeah, I think I would be on that side of the fence as well. I tend to look at the all caps as at the risk juvenile or immature and amateurish, and I don't mean that toward you, Pops, but it's a trait I see in really early writing, or perhaps I should say it's a trend I see overused in early writing. Again, if you're using it very deliberately in a very particular case, sometimes you can get away with it. But what I would do there, you're obviously trying to call attention to a particular word. I would think maybe lower caps and italicizing. Would that, do you think, get the point across? Is that what you guys would recommend? Or Alicia, you're nodding your head yes?
Yes. Typically, if you want to emphasize something, italics would be the way to go. But again, then that's, use it rarely, sparingly, yeah, because otherwise it becomes overkill for your reader.
Yeah, and it's using punctuation or font to try and convey something that your words should be doing on their own. Yep. So I always think that a really clean, well-written manuscript is going to have really clean, very subtle kind of punctuation, just enough to get the ideas across. Nothing to call attention to itself. That's where I fall on that particular issue. So the question mark in continuing our end marks would be pretty straightforward. You use it at the end of a sentence that asks a question, but it is interesting in the fact that you use it inside the quotation marks in dialogue, even though your sentence is not done. It's the one punctuation, the end mark, that you will use that is not replaced by a comma. See, a period would be replaced by a comma before the end quote, and an exclamation point can be replaced by a comma before the end quote, but the question mark does not get replaced. It stays as a question mark, and that the next word, such as he or she and he or she said, would still be lowercase. So I think that most people already know that. Did I state that correctly, Pops? Am I on the right page there?
No, I stopped listening after the last comment. I joke, I kid.
Tune in next week for family counseling on Christian fiction.
The number one reasons fathers and sons part ways is the exclamation point and the italicized word.
Yeah.
Yeah, question marks, for many, the question with the question mark is in dialogue, and do you put it outside the quote? So we'll talk about quotes in a little bit. But no, it's one of the two parts punctuation. One of the two-part punctuations is that there's the little hook and there's the dot that go inside dialogue. So it's I don't know about them being replaced by commas. As you said, a question mark can't be replaced by a comma, where you can get away with that with some of the others. Those are pretty straightforward, though.
Absolutely. Any other nuances that we've missed, Alicia?
One of the things that, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but one of the things that I think of when I think of the question mark versus the period, for example, is when someone's wondering something. I noticed that a lot of writers will say she wondered, and then it's a sentence. It's actually a statement, but it sounds sometimes when you read it like it's a question. And honestly, it's usually a statement that needs a period at the end of it and not the question mark.
Yeah, I think if you're beginning your sentence with "she wondered what," and then whatever it is she wondered, I would feel like that needs a period at the end. Otherwise, I don't even know how you would end that with a question mark. I guess it would be "she wondered, comma," and then what she wondered, question mark. I could see somebody doing that, but I would still think that the period would go there because we're still talking about what she wondered. Do you have a take on that, Pops?
Yeah, I think you really need to have a direct question to get the question mark. Saying he wondered or she wondered doesn't call for a question mark. But if the person thinks, can this be true, then you need a question mark. So it doesn't matter if it's internal dialogue, regular dialogue, narration. If there's a question that is put forward that's clear, and often you'll get the who, what, when, that kind of thing going on, then that's what you need for the question mark. Otherwise, I can't see it used many other ways that I can think of. It is one of those, along with the exclamation mark, that gets used sometimes repeated. You never repeat an exclamation mark, never repeat a question mark. Putting 3 question marks at the end of a sentence doesn't make it more of a question. It makes it more of a typo problem, editing problem. Same thing with exclamation marks. You put 5 in there, and it means you're a junior high girl trying to express emotion in a book. So watch out for that on the question mark also.
But what if I want to alternate question marks and exclamation points about 3 or 4 times? So it's just question mark, exclamation point, question mark, exclamation point, question mark, exclamation point. If I really have an excited question,
I will hunt you down.
With my red pen.
Yeah, terminal punctuation is called terminal punctuation because it's the end. If you put 3 or 4 together, then what do you count the first 4 before that? It's not terminal punctuation. So no, don't compound punctuation.
I got to do some editing on my manuscript. I'll be right back. All right. What about the possessive apostrophe? Now, this one is always fun. Is it the apostrophe S or is it the S apostrophe? For possessive cases on words that do not end in S, it is apostrophe S. So Bob, apostrophe S, would take that apostrophe. The apostrophe goes on the outside if the word ends with S. If it's plural, like cats, and all three cats share the same litter box, then it would be the cat's apostrophe litter box. Am I saying that right? Somebody correct me, because I'm terrified that I'm saying something wrong now.
Yeah, no, it's not quite that way, and it will depend who you consult on that. Sometimes they say you have to use the pronunciation. If it gets an extra syllable, then you use S apostrophe S. If it doesn't, then it's just the apostrophe, but other sources will do it a little bit differently. For example, with ancient names, Jesus, something belonging to Jesus, Jesus' disciples, it's S apostrophe, no S. And you use that with ancient names. Isis's temple, since it's an ancient name, it's just S apostrophe. So if you're doing something with Egyptian gods, one of the ways around that is just to rewrite the sentence and say the temple of Isis, the disciples of Jesus, and you can get around the problem. So I was looking a little earlier. I'll have to look it up real quick though, so I'll let you guys chat. But I was looking at Strunk and White a little bit about that, and he had a good summary of it. I'm going to throw it back to you for a second.
Sure, I've heard, and I'm going to let Alicia speak on this with more authority than what I can, but the rule that I'd seen was that if the word is one syllable, that it would take the apostrophe S, such as Bridget Jones's diary. Jones is one syllable, so it takes the apostrophe S. And if it's more than that, Jesus, multiple syllables, you would just use the apostrophe at the end. That's what I had heard, and that's what I had used, and it seemed to work, and I liked that explanation. But then I was corrected. I don't think that's accurate according to the Chicago Manual of Style. So I think Chicago Manual of Style says it more in line with what you were saying, Pops. How do you handle those cases, Alicia?
And this is where the editor will be forthright and honest. This is something that tends to confuse me as well, so I always double check myself many times throughout the manuscript, and I look it up multiple times while I'm editing. So you've got about as much authority on it as I have in this case, I believe.
Woohoo! Well,
so
it's Strunk and White. Great little book for those who may not have heard it. It's an older book. E.B. White wrote Charlotte's Web and other things. William Strunk had been his professor, and he used to give out a little book, and it's a great little book. And in fact, it's the first point in the book that you form the possessive singular of nouns by adding apostrophe S, which is what we've been talking about. But then he gives two examples that end in S and then use an apostrophe S. Charles's friend, but notice that's an extra syllable. Burns's poems. Yeah, I just write the poems of Burns. But anyway, Burns's poems would be S apostrophe S. So you will get some debate on that. My approach is if it adds an extra syllable, sometimes I will leave the S off. Other times I'll put it in, and I'll leave it up to the copy editor if you want to know the truth.
Yeah. So we're all kind of all over the map on that one. I do want to make a distinction though. Talk with your editor about it. Make sure you're referring back to this Chicago Manual of Style or Strunk and White. Make sure you've got some basis for why you do it. But there are a wide variety of ways to handle that. But the important thing is I do want to make the distinction that there's a difference between singular possessive, which would be like Bridget Jones's diary. It's one person possessing something, but it ends with S. So that's where the confusion comes in. If it's a common noun like cats, that's plural, then the apostrophe comes on the outside with no S at the end. And I think that's a pretty hard and fast rule. So there's a difference between possessive plural and singular possessive where the singular ends in the S. That's where the confusion starts to come in. So
you're talking about collective possessions, right?
Yes.
Yeah, collective possessions, which is what your plural there, get just the apostrophe. I'm just looking something up here. So
Well, one thing that I was just thinking that is really elementary, I guess, is you wouldn't say Katz's litter box. So you're only going to have the S apostrophe. You're not going to add that extra S on the end.
I don't know. I might say Katz's, just for fun.
Well, for fun. But
Well, I mean,
in your manuscript.
But if it's Dr. Katz and it's his office, singular, now it's Dr. Katz's.
Now it's Dr. Katz's, yeah.
Hey, isn't English wonderfully fun? I'm going with no on that one. Now let's move away from something so confusing as a possessive apostrophe and get to something a little more meaty, a little more hot debate topic here, and that would be the Oxford comma or the serial comma, the stuff that Pops, you said copy editors like to get into fisticuffs over. And what we're talking about here, just so you know, is when you are listing something, the Oxford comma, it's commonly referred to as the Oxford comma or a serial comma, is I'm going to do X, comma, Y, comma, and Z. The final comma there, the one before and Z, is the one that's debated. A lot of times people will say because you have the conjunction that you don't need the comma. They would say, I'm going to do X, comma, Y, and Z. Whereas other people will say, no, you need that Oxford comma, you need that serial comma. I'm going to do X, comma, Y, comma, and Z. I like it, personally. I'm a fan of the Oxford comma. If I weren't already married, I might marry the Oxford comma. For me, it just makes things a little easier, but a little clearer. But then again, I'm not always, 100% correct. Sometimes those depends on what manual you're looking at. Pops, you had something consideration to make when thinking of the serial comma here.
Yeah, I'm tempted to say that all right-thinking people use the Oxford comma, but it is highly debated. Now, to tell you where the debate comes from, it's the difference between people who are writing book-length work and those who write in journalism. In journalism, the AP style says not to use the serial comma, the one before the conjunction and the last item that's listed. But you have to understand why that is. In newspaper writing, they were very stingy about space, and taking a comma out would save a little space, and if you did it throughout a newspaper, you could save a fair amount of space, so that was the motivation behind it. However, it can lead to other problems, and you cannot go wrong with a serial comma. So, for example, you can get into trouble. Uncle Joe, I'm going to give you a sentence here, Uncle Joe's will gave $1 million to Bob, comma, Mary, comma, Joe and Buford, period. Now, a lawyer's going to look at that, and the lawyer's going to say, okay, so Bob gets $1 million, Mary gets $1 million, and Joe and Buford split $1 million. If you're Buford, you want that comma, because if you insert the comma after Joe, so it would be Bob, comma, Mary, comma, Joe, comma, and Buford, now you get $4 million going out, and they each get $1 million. If you take the Oxford comma, the serial comma out, then Joe and Buford are fighting over or splitting probably the $1 million. So that happens. There's even in the Bill of Rights about the right to bear arms. There's a big debate about whether or not a comma was purposely left out or put in, and it's a serial comma. So it's important. My thinking is, especially if you're writing anything of length, you're not worried about space. Put it in, you can't go wrong. There's no way a serial comma is going to mess you up. Leaving it out, you have to be very careful.
And what do you think of that, Alicia?
I agree 100%. I think it's worth it to leave it in because things can get very confusing if you leave it out.
All right, and we have Becky Lindsay listening in. Hello, Becky, as well as Molly Jo, and I think I saw some other faces in there as well. But the reason I mentioned Becky Lindsay is because her daughter works for a newspaper, and her daughter is listening and has mentioned that at the newspaper at which she works, they do not use the Oxford comma, and her editor has gotten on her for that. And I think, Pops, that you'd mentioned that, right? In journalism, you're trying to save some space. Because you're trying to fit everything on a particular...
Well, initially, that was one of the goals, is just you save space wherever you can. Now, through the years, it's become custom, and the comma, the Oxford comma, was taken out in newspapers. So AP recommends not using it CMOS recommends using it, and so do some of the others. So, as I said, if you're writing book-length stuff, you don't have to worry about it. But if you're in journalism, then you're going to be following a slightly different style sheet. And another place we see this, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later, is the hyphen in email. AP has just taken the hyphen out, so you write email without the hyphen. And frankly, I think it's ridiculous. I don't want to say all journalists are wrong. They're not, but because what you end up with is Immel. If you use proper pronunciation, it's just going to be Immel with that. CMOS has left the hyphen in, and so that's also true for ebook and other such things.
So has the dictionary. An editor's backup to the CMOS is always the dictionary for spelling, especially with hyphenation. And the dictionary still has the hyphen in there.
Right.
Good.
It's probably Webster's. That's
Yes.
what most publishers use, Webster's Collegiate.
Yep.
And when you mention AP Pops, you're talking about the Associated Press, correct?
Right.
Yeah. So again, the difference, I think it's important. The difference is are you writing a newspaper article or are you writing fiction? And if you're writing a novel, a short story, maybe you go ahead and you use the serial comma, the Oxford comma. Maybe that's best for you. But if you're writing a blog entry, maybe you want to default more to the journalistic style and assuage. That's completely eschew. Is that the word I'm looking for?
Eschew?
Eschew, to avoid.
ESCHEW?
Yeah, that's a real word. Don't bother looking it up. Save yourself some time. It's real. Trust me.
Meaning to avoid.
There. That's what I'm working for. That's
okay.
a better word. So, avoid the Oxford comma if you're maybe perhaps doing a blog entry. It's been a long day. I don't know if you guys can tell. Have you noticed? It's been a long day for me.
No.
Right on my game. So. Now, Pops, you had something else here beneath the Oxford comma about wonder if they're going versus are they going. Did you add that in?
No, that's not me. You are having a tough day. That's you.
I don't believe I put that in. Was that you, Alicia, that put that in the show notes?
It may have been Bethany.
So we did have Bethany Kazmarek lined up to come on the show tonight, and she left herself some notes on the show notes. But unfortunately, I'm not sure what they mean. She came down, I think, with some sort of cold or something. She said it hit her pretty hard, really fast. And so, our thoughts were with her tonight, and she's sleeping right now. So that's good for her. Sleep it off. Feel better, Bethany. I'm very sorry that I cannot figure out what you're mentioning here. I will say that. What's that, Pops?
Let me give it a shot.
Okay, maybe you can do it.
Time is a tough call. At times it's a tough call, I think, is what she's trying to say here. And so her example is a comparison of two phrases. I wonder if they're going versus are they going ? Which one is correct? My opinion on it is if you're trying to emphasize the first person, then I wonder if they're going makes a lot of sense. If it's dialogue, are they going ? Would probably be my choice, if that's what she means.
Well, considering the next bullet says, I'm confused about whether this one needs a period ? I think she might be having a little bit of fun here and demonstrating what, Alicia, you were talking about earlier. She wondered if the sentence needed a ? So I think we've kind of talked a little bit about that. And statements still take periods even if the statement is about a question. So I think we did talk about that a little bit. So we're good there. Now let's move on to the nitty-gritty.
No question mark on that one.
Yeah. We're kind of running out of time. So I want to very quickly, because we've got a lot of punctuation that we actually didn't get to. So I want to do, if I can, just a really super brief explanation of some of these other punctuation things, and then I want to spend a little bit of time, if we can quickly go over some of the dialogue rules or the quotation mark rules about whether the punctuation comes inside or outside. But some of the other punctuation that we don't often use would be hyphens, which are of course used to join multiple words together to form compound words, especially with the e prefixes, like you were saying, Pops, email, etc. Colons, you're going to use when you're about to list something, and you can say the following items were brought on the picnic, colon. So if you've got something like that, you might use your colon. Semicolons, a lot of people you'll hear say just don't use semicolons. I disagree with that. I think they have a very definite function, and that's to join two closely related sentences. So on either side of a semicolon, you're going to have an independent clause. That is, you're going to have a subject and a verb pair on either side of that semicolon, and it can be very impactful. For example, you might have I teach, or I teach, semicolon, you learn. And that might, or you learn, semicolon, I help. Something like that, where you have two very short things together joined by a semicolon.
Aaron?
Yes.
If I may, and it's definitely a semicolon, not a comma.
Thank you. If you use a comma there, you have the dreaded comma splice.
Yes.
Which, if you're a grammar ninja, you might get away with a comma slice. Okay. But a comma splice, and what the reason is, you need some sort of mark in between the independent clauses, and so semicolons will join independent clauses together. A comma and a coordinating conjunction can also join them together, but there's got to be some sort of punctuation that brings them together, and if you don't have that coordinating conjunction, then it's got to be that semicolon.
Right, the semicolon takes away the conjunction.
Yeah.
It substitutes for it. It's on the one hand, semicolon, on the other hand. There's this, semicolon, there's that. So I always think of, in those types of sentences, I think of the semicolon as being a fulcrum on a teeter-totter. You have the two sides, and it balances it out.
Yeah. Good point. That's a really good way to think of it. I will use that to explain that to my students. I know I'm going super fast here, so...
Let me say one thing about hyphens, though, if I may. Hyphenating, especially building compound words, is very tricky. It will depend on which dictionary you use. Most book publishers use Webster's, the latest Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. The way it hyphenates words is different than, say, the American Dictionary or the Oxford English Dictionary. Yeah, he's holding that up there. I don't know if anyone got to see that. Maybe they saw it at the bottom of the screen. You have to refer to that on hyphenations, because it's not always the same. And if you're using your spell checker, the spell checker uses a different dictionary. So sometimes you just have to go back and look them up the old-fashioned way.
Good times. Or you could just do it online. Webster's, I'm sure, has an online.
Websters.com, yeah.
Yeah. We've got M dashes and N dashes, and I think we've already talked about that on a publishing term of the day. Pops, did you want to do a quick comparison of the two?
Yeah, because that was done quite a while ago, and we'll have new people. An M dash is a longer dash than an N dash. An N dash is longer than a hyphen. An N dash you use very rarely, and it's usually with numbers. So if you say between the years of 1920 and then 1925, you'd use an N dash in there, not an M dash. M dash is called an M dash because in the old typesetting days, it's the same width of the letter M. An N dash is called an N dash because it's the same width as, anybody want to guess? The letter N. Yeah, the Q. Q was close. The letter N. And that's why they're called that. It's a spacing reference from the old printer days. With that, they're very, very useful in fiction. I would say this: M dash indicates a sudden break, like in dialogue, somebody interrupts you. What you need to know: shut up, I don't want to hear it. You would finish the first line with an M dash because they've been interrupted. If you use an ellipse in trailing thought, where somebody just doesn't finish the sentence, so they're a little different. M dash is strong, and you can also use an M dash as a stronger parentheses mark.
And you just brought up the last one that I wanted to mention, which was ellipses. For those of you unfamiliar with the term ellipses, it's an ellipsis is 3 periods together, ... I feel about ellipses the way I feel about exclamation points, and I'm sure I'm going to be in the minority here, so you two can champion the ellipses and tell me how wonderful it is, but I try to avoid and eschew, the too much fun with that word, the ellipses as much as possible. Even in trailing thoughts, I'll find some other way to do it, and I think that's just my own neurosis. There's no hard and fast editorial rule that says ellipses are bad. I don't know what it is about them, but it's something that I try and avoid in my writing. Are you a fan of them, Alicia?
I loathe the ellipses because I've seen so many writers use them as a natural pause in their sentences, where it should be a comma, not an ellipses. And I've actually seen a manuscript where she used them all the time, and she did not want to take them out. And she gave me every reason under the sun why she didn't need to take them out. So I finally had to let her go her own way with the ellipses. But yes, it is very misused and abused and needs to not be used as much.
Well, it's like anything. It's easy to overuse, and it's hard to. They're more impactful. The fewer there are, the more impactful they become.
Yep.
Pops, you mentioned that they're good for especially trailing off thought, and I will agree with that. I think that's an appropriate use for them. But I also agree that as long as you're not overusing it, if you've got every character trailing off in thought every 2.5 paragraphs, then that's problematic. Your characters are a little bit spacey.
Yeah, I worked on someone's project and had, I think, an average of 15 on every page, which is just beyond the pale. You just and it takes. And if you're paying for editing, especially by the hour, it's going to cost you a bunch. But just because they're overused or misused doesn't mean it doesn't have value. So I use them for trailing thought or a long pause, where something happens and the person pauses and then says something, but I don't even do those very much. In stuttering, some people want to use them for stuttering. You use a hyphen for stutter between the words, like I, and then whatever the rest of it is. But no, I think they have great use in fiction, especially in dialogue for trailing thought. Just don't overuse them. Don't use them in place of commas to indicate pauses. And the thing to remember, and I can't hammer this home enough, when you're writing, you are writing for the eye, not the ear. And some people get that, some confusion about that. They get that all mixed up because the reader, whether you're using e-books or print books, you're writing for the eye, and they will see on the page all these ellipses or em dashes, the other one that's overused. They'll see all of those, are the exclamation marks or whatever it might be, and it stands out like a sore thumb. Looks very amateurish. So with all things, moderation.
Agreed, and I like how you say that. Again, the more power, if you want it to be powerful, you have to use it less, and you just can't use it that much. I had another really good, solid point to make, and it's no longer in my mind, so we will check the memory banks later. But we started a little bit later, so if we end a little bit later tonight, I guess it will be okay, because I do want to get to quotation marks and dialogue. And I think we've already covered a lot of this, that your punctuation, your end marks are going to come inside the quotation marks, specifically when you are using dialogue. Now, if you're just using quotes around, say, a title of a poem, the quotation then, as I recall, goes on the outside. So I just finished reading quotation because I could not stop for death. Quotation period, or is it period quotation in that sense? Who wants to help me out with that?
I always put the punctuation inside, with the exception of two pieces of punctuation. The semicolon and the colon have a hall pass. They don't go inside quotation marks. Why, you ask? I haven't a clue. It makes no sense to me. But nonetheless, that's the way it is. So in that case, even though, and I have seen it done the other way, sometimes a question mark, have you read, open quote, I could not stop for death, close quote, question mark. Some sources will tell you to put it outside the quotes on that, but if it's a period, I usually put it on the inside. Unless you're British, and then it all goes on the outside of the quotes.
Yeah, I've heard that British is outside, American is inside, but Again, that's MLA has changed the way they do it. MLA is usually the style guide I go by, but they've changed several times, back and forth, and so it's hard to find even consistency among that. How do you handle that, Alicia?
I typically put the punctuation inside the quotation marks. I don't usually leave them outside if it's at the end of a sentence in particular. Yeah, I go with with Pops.
Yeah. All right. Well done. Okay. Is there anything else with the quotation marks? I know sometimes dialogue can be confusing. The only other real concern or somewhat confusing thing that I can think of are the quotes within the quotes and the dialogue that runs longer than a paragraph. So with the quotes within the quotes, you alternate. You start with the double quotes, quotation marks. So if we're quoting me, Pops is the greatest writer I've ever read. He's really smart, and he always says, okay, now single quote because the person speaking is now quoting somebody else. And then what you do is you mirror that. So, and that can alternate. So it's double, single, all the way through. But when you're closing things off, it has to be mirrored. So it's double, single, double. Yeah. And that's the way it goes. And then again, if paragraph, if your character is giving this long epic speech that goes on for more than one paragraph, open quotes, and then when you get to the end of the paragraph, you do not close the quotes. You leave it open. You start your next paragraph with open quotes again, right? And then you kind of go on, and then once they're done speaking, you'll close the quotes. That throws some people sometimes because they'll say, oh, you missed a quotation mark here. Technically, no, and the reason you don't do that is because if you close it there and start it again in the following paragraph, now the assumption is this is a brand new speaker. This is another character speaking, and then your reader is going to be confused. Who's talking now? And so that's why you leave it open. Did I get all that right, Pops?
Yeah, you did, unless you're British. And then it starts single quote, double quote. And I don't know why. I think we in America changed because we were a little miffed at them, the British, back in the 1700s. No, I think you have that right. You start with the double quotes, single quote inside. If you have to do a quote within a quote within a quote, you need to rewrite the sentence. You can do that. I've seen double quote, single quote, double quote, into double quote, single quote, double quote. I know it's going to sound really odd, especially if you're listening on audio only. The point is that at that point you need to rewrite the sentence somehow. And then on the paragraph one, you're absolutely correct. You don't close out the quote. You just move on to the next one. But I'm finding that more and more people aren't familiar with that. So what I will do sometimes is I'll go ahead and close paragraph one out with a quotation mark, and then I will add a beat of some sort. You know, he continued. I don't like dialogue attributions to begin with, but sometimes you have to use them. Then he continued, or he sat himself and then continued, or whatever it might be, and then you can get away from that. Don't do it too often because then it becomes contrived. But you said it right. You've done good.
All right. Is anything that we missed, Alicia?
No, I think that covered that.
Okay. Wow, that went a lot faster than I anticipated. I thought there were going to be all sorts of, I'm going to check the room real quick and see if there are any sort of questions.
Okay, while you're doing that, I would say this to the listeners. One thing you can do is be consistent. If you're always consistent, even if you're doing it wrong, it is much easier to fix up. So, for example, if you're frequently putting the period outside a quote, it is very easy to do a find and replace. And what the editor will do, or what you can do, is you can put the quote, period, replace with period, quote. And you can do hundreds of pages in mere moments doing it that way. But you have to be consistent. If you're inconsistent, well then, no telling what you're going to end up with.
Absolutely. I'm not seeing a lot of questions in the chat room other than Becky Lindsay wants to know, we said we should use something less, and she didn't know what we were talking about because her audio cut out. I think we said ellipses and exclamation points were the ones that we said try to use less. Molly Jo has mentioned Kathy Ide's book, Proofreading Secrets of Best-Selling Authors. which is a good book as well. So if you're looking for another book to have on your shelf for editing purposes, that's a good one to pick up. Kathy Ide, The Proofreading Secrets of Best-Selling Authors. And so other than that, just we got Molly being playful with all her exclamation points and making us cringe. I don't see her using any ellipses, so points to you, Molly Jo, for avoiding and eschewing the ellipses. So good job that.
Well, just remind Molly that every exclamation point costs $20.
$20.
But if you really want that exclamation mark.
Payable to Aaron Gansky, care of First in Fiction. All right. So let's go ahead and wrap it up here tonight. Good episode. Alicia, we really enjoyed having you on. Thank you for joining us and keeping us on the right track here. How can our listeners get in touch with you and find out what you're up to and perhaps secure your services as an editor if you have any openings there?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. And I co-author an editing writing blog with Andrea Merrill at www.therightediting.com, and we put up a post typically every Monday, and once a month we have a guest poster. So that is where I can be found, and there are tabs on the blog. Meet Alicia, meet Andrea, and if you click on mine, that will take you to my editing information.
All right. The you gave us the website, but it was the right editing. Which right? W-R-I-T-E?
Oh, yes, W-R-I-T-E.
Okay, not the correct editing, the right editing.
Right editing, yes.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
I tried to go there, but I got the left editing instead.
Yeah.
I think I took a wrong turn somewhere. So, Pops, how can people get in touch with you?
All the usual ways. AltonGansky.com is good. I am on the Twitternator, but I don't do much tweeting. And I'm also on Facebook. Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference, which is BRMCWC, is where I'll do more talking about writing, along with Edie Melson. And that's sort of our encouragement spot for writers. Even though it's tied to the Writers Conference, it goes year-round. So you can always hop over there and get some encouragement and some insight over at brmcwc.com.
Absolutely. Good stuff there. And as always, you guys can find me on the Facebook and the Twitter and at aarongansky.com for all your First in Fiction needs. We thank you all for listening, and until next week when we talk about humor in writing, should be very funny. Until next week, good writing.